Hello, Free Speech and the Challenge of Social Media students. Dr. Conway here for Lesson 5 on the political and social importance of free speech. Let's place this quickly into context of our course's narrative. In Lesson 1, we overviewed the narrative for the course, and we identified some items that would make you successful in the course. So don't forget to go back and look at those lessons on how to do well in the course and remind yourself from time to time, okay? In the second lesson, we gave the key concepts that are applicable to the study of free speech and social media, right? So we dealt with all the key concepts, which become our tools for communicating with some accuracy, a common understanding of the concepts between students, okay? Then in week 3, we laid out some of the current legal infrastructure for free speech, its protection and its limitations. And these are real world legal issues, right? So when we're talking about these things in our discussion board debates and so on, we can't pretend we don't know about these things, right? We have to demonstrate our knowledge and lay out the facts related to them whenever we can, all right? So remember that. And when we're dealing with discussion boards, don't talk necessarily always in the abstract, but you can have an opinion, but you have to situate that opinion in current understandings that you have, things you've learned about the way free speech is protected and the way free speech is limited within our liberal democracy, okay? Limited for what most people would say are good reasons, right? And that's why they ended up being approved by Parliament and put into criminal law, okay? And the Supreme Court rulings and things like that, okay? Then in week 4, I've just gave you a little bit of a pause to reflect on the material so far and to get yourself ready for your first scripted video, all right? And that's okay. Taking a little pause after 3 weeks is fine to focus on getting prepared for what you're going to have to do for your first scripted video in week 7, all right? So in lesson 5 today, we're returning to situating free speech in the political and social importance of it to today's society, all right? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's look a little bit of how did we get to where we are in terms of both our belief systems about free speech, right? How we believe in it, the way much of that came out in your discussion boards, right? In your first discussion board. But now we're going to situate that in a context, okay? And also understanding how did we end up with the legal infrastructure for free speech and its limitations in our society? What belief systems led to that, all right? And it's important to cover this before we start getting more fully into engaging social media in this discussion, right? But let's situate free speech in political theory first, right? And in how free speech is being shaped by social media, right? And how abuses of social media can impact free speech as we understand it, okay? So let's give a sort of an overview, a narrative in this area. So free speech and liberal political theory, right? We are a liberal democracy, right? Not liberal in terms of a name of a political party, right? But liberal democracy in terms of the name of a form of political governance, right? Which is what our political system is. Okay, so let's not confuse the two, right? When we call it a liberal democracy, it's not because we support a particular political party necessarily, but because that's the label given to our form of government, which we adopted from the British system of government, right? But also the American system, which is a republic, is a liberal democratic system, okay? So let's look at this. What's going on with free speech in our society? How did we come up with the values and beliefs about it that we have? And it's useful to think of 2 different perspectives, at least for purposes of our course, right, on free speech that are still paradigmatic or dominant in liberal democratic societies today. A paradigm is a traditional accepted way of looking at something, right? That is generally not questioned until it comes into conflict with an overwhelming new social, political, or economic reality in society, right? It's the things that we walk around in our heads with as being, oh, that's just the way it is. or that's the way it should be, or that's the way it always has been. These are dominant thoughts, what we call paradigms, that we walk around in our heads with, that help us organize reality in society, help us understand it, help us filter out things we deem to be acceptable and things we don't deem to be acceptable, right? So so let's look at these things. I mean, it's important to understand that for early liberal democratic theorists, okay, democratic forms of government were desirable because they could advance the liberty of the individual. And I think we would all agree that that's how we would define a liberal democracy like Canada, say, from an authoritarian state like Belarus or China or some other governments, right? Where it's very clear that if you cross the government, you can end up in jail or disappear or whatever the case may be, right? I think we would all agree that liberal democracy historically has enhanced individual liberty and human liberty, right? And which we more commonly call today freedoms, right? But how does free speech relate to that, right? Why is free speech important to that? But, you know, the idea of liberty and the idea of freedoms in a liberal democracy is paradigmatic, right? That's, remember, the concept of paradigm, right? Is a traditional accepted way of looking at something, right? And I think we would all agree that we tend to look at liberal democracy as being liberty enhancing, right? And it would be hard to dispute that factually as well. Now, no liberty in any state is going to be absolute, right? There are always going to be some restrictions on liberty to protect the social whole or the community as a whole, as a society, right? That's just reality. There's no such thing as complete liberty in any political regime, because as soon as you establish a political regime, you have to establish rules. We all have to adhere to the rules. Those rules restrict our absolute liberty, all right? They can also protect our discrete liberty, all right, relative to what you would find, say, in other regimes that I mentioned. And for liberal theorists, free speech was and still is seen as a key measure of liberty and a vital ingredient of democracy, right? Without question. This continues to be the predominant paradigm of all liberal democratic thought, okay? Free expression is seen as essential for democracies because this is how citizens, one, right, discuss their common understandings as a community. We stay as a community because despite what you see in the media and the conflicts between political parties and the media trying to get everybody amped up with opinion pieces and all of that kind of stuff, the fact is that the predominant core of our belief system in our liberal democracy is that liberal democracy is good, that it provides us with freedoms, it provides us with protections. And this is the world around us, the empirical evidence around us would reinforce that. Okay, but that does not mean that it's absolute liberty. That does not mean that there's not going to be debate and discussion around the edges. But the core principles remain vastly predominant in our society. Okay, free speech, the liberal theorists would argue, also forms political opinions in a dialogue with others. That's how we dialogue. You know, if liberal democracy says the power of the people matters, then the people have to be able to discuss things and come to some basic agreement that somewhere falls below civil war or some other major conflict, right? And we require free speech to build that community consensus that for the most part, for the most people, this seems to be a viable path forward for our community, right? That's what free speech provides you with, right? And then third, it allows us to reach political decisions that are broadly accepted as in the common interest, right? So when we have elections, we're having a broad public debate of what most people feel is generally in the common interest. And even when you see political parties having hotly debated issues in electoral politics, which is what our system calls for, right? It needs that, okay? Even when that occurs, you know, we're talking about the final 10 to 15%, right? There's about 85 to 90% that almost every political party active in a liberal democracy would fundamentally agree with. like the right of citizens before the law, the right of private property, the right of being able to express your opinion openly, the right of all those rights. If you talk to an NDP person, they would say, yeah, absolutely. Talk to a liberal person, of course. Talk to a conservative person, most definitely. Right? So the vast majority of the things that are core to our liberal democracy are in broad belief because they are paradigmatic. And free speech allows us to reinforce that belief system, right, amongst ourselves. And we do that through free speech, even if you do not perceive it, because what you see on the surface is, he's disagreeing with this person. Yeah, but fundamentally the disagreements, when you look at the entire thing that sustains our system, those disagreements are on the margins. It doesn't mean they're not important, but it does mean it's not a challenge of the core paradigmatic beliefs of a liberal democracy. Okay? So let's look at the liberal theorists. Okay? What are the two perspectives that we can see? Well, the first, these are dominant perspectives. Of course, there are sub-schools. But for our perspective, this is a good characterization. Okay? Liberal theory typified by John Stuart Mill. We saw that before I go any further, we saw some of this in the last discussion, right? In discussion board 1. We saw that paradigm coming out from some students, and let's explain what that paradigm says, right? Students from their high school education, folks like you, might remember the name John Stuart Mill, the 19th century liberal philosopher, and his famous essay called On Liberty, which became a predominant liberal democratic document, in addition to others, but informed a lot of early liberal democratic thinking, okay? Mill posited that the pursuit of liberty justified restrictions on unlimited state and social control. Remember, this is a period when fledgling liberals were starting to battle against monarchies, okay? So this was a historical period where the people, having now been getting a little bit wealthier and more educated, are pursuing their freedoms, all right? So John Stuart Mill comes along and he publishes On Liberty, eh? And he says that, the citizens have a right to restrict unlimited state and control of the people, social control, right? And that free speech was essential to to limiting that state dominance, and it's essential to liberty itself, is what John Stuart Mill was saying. He said, without free speech, we cannot mobilize together. We cannot reach common consensus. We cannot pursue objectives together. We cannot argue against the monarch. Right? We can't point out the hypocrisy of a political system. We can't we don't have a major tool to defend ourselves and to communicate with each other if we don't have free speech, right? And obviously for the historical period that John Stuart Mill was writing in, it was very true, right? I mean, we're talking about, what we have some authoritarian regimes today was much the same, right? Say something bad against the president, you can get poisoned in an authoritarian state. I think the recent example we have of that, right? And other things like that. So from Mill's perspective, free speech should be encouraged and tolerated, even when speech could be wrong and potentially harmful. This was Mill's complete libertarian perspective on free speech, all right? He believed that discovering truth through free speech could be achieved through the unregulated marketplace of ideas. Right? A very economic concept, right? He applied to the political environment. A marketplace of ideas. And this was of great utility for society, he felt. And accolades of his, other theorists who supported Mill. Mill believed that none of us is infallible and we could be wrong. And for that reason, we must permit dissident or opposing opinions to compete in this marketplace. And I keep talking about this marketplace because I want you to understand that as we get into talking about social media, we'll ask what impact social media is having on this concept of an open, non-barriered marketplace. Is that really what we have in social media? Or do we have funnels and bubbles in social media? Okay, so we're going to park that concept for now, okay? But later on, we're going to pick it up again. Mill also understood that while our ideas might be true in part, we are more likely to understand the entire truth and people's relationship to it if we are exposed to different perspectives on the truth and its meaning. Okay. Another thing, though, that you can see in Mill's supposition is that there's an assumption that we're all on the equal level when we share our views and we debate and so on, right? That's that assumption that's there, right? It's a very egalitarian assumption. This is a theory that's developed before we have large, powerful organizations that shape narratives, media organizations that shape narratives, social media that creates funnels. How far do we take this marketplace of ideas concept, and does it still apply? Do we still have that? Or do we have such a huge flood of information all occurring in various funnels to different people at different times? Do we really have a marketplace, or do we have a partition into little marketplaces? Okay? And this is one of the things that social media, presents to us as a question. All right? Is Mill still applicable to the current scene as we have it? There's no question there's elements of it. I don't think anybody would disagree that free speech is important to liberal democracy. I don't think anybody would disagree with the basic notion that if we're forced to compete in the marketplace of ideas, the dominant ideas will have a tendency to rise to the surface and the bad ideas will sink, right? People would like to believe that, but we also have to look at the institutional and process issues that may interfere with that, right? Which is a lot of what this course is about when we say the terms free speech and the challenge of social media, right? Finally, even if our beliefs seem to be entirely according to factual evidence, says Mill, okay, we are likely to have stronger convictions about the truth if we confront the false opinions of others in the marketplace of ideas. If our information is truthful and factual and we can replicate it, remember, a fact is something that can be replicated. Truth is comprised of factual information that can be replicated, right? If we're confident that we have that, then we shouldn't have any problems opposing conspiracy theories or other things in the public eye. In theory, okay? Now, in practice, we see that we have more information today, more factual information, more access to it than we've ever had in human history. But at the same time, we also have a burgeoning quantity of conspiracy theories running in social media. So, what's going on here? And thus, we have a course called Free Speech and the Challenge of Social Media, right? But for Mill, it still applied. Stated another way, defeating falsehoods in the open competition of ideas strengthens the truth. And that's what he believed. Mill's perspective is perhaps the purest defense of free speech in liberal theory. It still has major influence on citizen views throughout liberal democracies to this day, even if the context between the 19th century and today and how information is moved through social media and otherwise has completely transformed. So we have to look at these things and say there's no question there's a lot of paradigmatic value in what Mill said, but how much of it can be carried through to the current context? Okay? An open question. I have my views, but I'm asking you to form your views. Okay? Then there's a second predominant school of thought is called free speech absolutely, but not without limits. All right? And this is a school of thought that has emerged primarily in the late 20th and early 21st century, or the second half of the 20th and early 21st centuries, right? Despite the outsized influence of Mill's theory in liberal democracies, that perspective does not reign free, and we've seen it does not reign free, right? We have Supreme Court decisions saying hate speech bad, right? We have had Supreme Court decisions saying discrediting a person in public without truthfulness is illegal. We have Supreme Court rulings in the law saying uttering threats to another human being is illegal. We have, there's lots of instances. We have restrictions on free speech and marketing and all the. So obviously, while Mill's theory is still predominant, we have in practice something more akin to what this theory is talking about. And let me talk to you about it a bit more. So also present in liberal theory. So this is just not activists today, right? This is the other liberal theorists who are in the same school of thought generally as Mill, but have taken a different perspective on the question of free speech, liberty, and democracy. Okay? So their notion posits that to defend important societal values, some defenses against harmful speech are necessary. And obviously our political systems have agreed with this, right, as we saw from lesson 3, right? This argument essentially posits that society should be seeking a higher level of public expression that has real epistemic value. What does epistemic mean? Epistemic value essentially means knowledge and understanding based on validated facts and truth, making real contributions to society and its growth. Okay? Increasingly, scholars have begun to argue that social media presents especially troubling outcomes in terms of epistemic value, and thus democracy should be open to its regulation or control in some way, which we already are, because the private sector companies, social media companies, are already starting to regulate themselves, right? And suffice it to say, they're not doing that out of the goodness of their health, right? Or the goodness of their heart, or for their health. They're doing it because there's a public demand that it be done. That it's manifesting itself through consumers and through political systems, right? Let's not kid ourselves, right? They're doing it for a reason. So there must be a strong element, a strong paradigm element of this theory in society as well, because we're seeing it in practice, all right? So as this argument follows, what we are seeing today on social media is a condition where the propagation of falsehoods, disregard for facts and expertise, the undermining of truth through conspiracy theories, etc., may undermine the value of free expression and liberal democracy, and less liberal democracy itself. So in other words, if free speech becomes weaponized for the purposes of untruthfulness and aggression and these types of things, and saying that's okay, it's free speech, is it really? Or are we actually bringing free speech into disrepute? So it's never one direction or another, right? It's never, all of these swords have two edges, all right? So yes, we can argue openly, free speech on everything, absolutely, do whatever you want. Call my grandmother any name you want. But the fact is that if you continue to do that, you have social media with greater reach at faster speeds than any time in human history, and we allow that to propagate, are we not bringing free speech into disrepute? And thus we could be bringing liberal democracy into disrepute. And we'll talk about how troll factories for propagating disinformation and so on tried to do that, right? So you have to understand that free speech, yes, absolutely, very few of us would disagree with that, but protecting free speech is also an issue, all right? So from this perspective, the lowest common denominator of speech enabled by social media is also said to undercut the eudaimonic well-being of individuals. And what does eudaimonic mean? Eudaimonic well-being refers to the subjective experience associated with living a life of virtue and pursuit of human excellence. Like we have lots of reports and lots of studies, for example, that have been done that how social media use, particularly in the youth, creates anxiety, depression, and sometimes can lead to suicide and other stresses, right, of social media. I'm sure everybody in our class has experienced some stress related to social media, right? And so what people are saying that if we're spending time on social media, and in addition to the stresses it causes just through normal human interactions, particularly if they're anonymous and people are saying nasty things or whatever, but at the end of the day, we're creating a situation where we're undermining the eudaimonic well-being of life because we're creating issues, right? Now this is, it's hard to dispute that there's not at least a significant amount of this going on. Now, is that justification then for controlling all of social media and free speech? Obviously, in my opinion, it's not. But we would also be equally naive to assume that it doesn't exist, because it does exist. We know it exists, okay? But stated in layman terms, if we want society to do well, this is what these theorists say, we need to have higher standards of free speech based on its value added, and those standards must be enforced. We can't allow these conspiracy theories to propagate, hateful language not based on fact to propagate. Because what? In the social media environment, maybe that marketplace of ideas that Mill had in his mind at a day in an age when everything moved slower and the only information you got was a newspaper that maybe was, or a document that was maybe produced once a week, or if not once a month. Information traveled much slower. All of these things could be then seen as this snail's pace marketplace of ideas. Now we might be better positioned to call it a storm of ideas. All right, in numerous marketplaces, some of them partitioning people and dividing them. All right, and that's definitely what this theory would conclude on a lot of what social media is doing. All right, so but remember, right, this is one school of thought, right, and we need to make our own judgments about where we're coming down on these things, right. So from this perspective, what this means is that some government institution or other institutional mechanisms must be present to regulate the quality of speech, or at least point out untruths, hurtful language, and so on. All right, and we're also seeing that in society today, right? And we'll learn about that more as we go through the course, about things as spotting falsehoods, untruths of organizations set up to capture hate speech. All these things are out there today because the predominant view, the John Stuart Mill's paradigm is still out there and very active in the community. This second view seems to be more prevalent in practice, okay, in terms of how law has emerged to prevent hate speech and the other things we've already learned about, right? And how social media organizations are coming under pressure to regulate themselves, keeping the nasty stuff, the untruthful stuff, the conspiracy theories off their sites, and these kinds of things, and NGOs forming up to catch lies and to counteract hate speech and all of these kinds of things, of which there are many NGOs now around the world to do that, right? So obviously that paradigm is also very powerful in our society, right? So, whether we know it or not, and you should have seen it in our first discussion board chat, you can see both those paradigms there, right? You can see them very active. You had some students coming out and say, free speech, absolutely, and very much, talking about the openness and challenging each other. And that was very much the marketplace of ideas thing right there, right? Even if you didn't realize it, you see how a paradigm works, right? It's in your head. You think that way because you've always been taught to think that way. And it is a dominant paradigm in society. Right, but you also had lots of people in the class speaking the other direction, more the second school of thought, right? Where yes, free speech, but let's protect people and let's be responsible. Let's have good eudemonic value. A lot of those assumptions were buried there as well, right? So you could see the two dominant paradigms working in our first class discussion, which I thought was excellent. Okay. So then it comes to, the question is social media, is it at odds with democracy? It's a legitimate question. Some political theorists would say absolutely it is in a lot of cases, primarily drawing from the second liberal democratic theory on free speech, right? Political, social, and economic leaders around the world now accept that social media has become a major force shaping public discourse in our society. And remember what free speech is supposed to do, right? Have debates, build consensus, support the community, and so on, right? Is that what we're getting in social media today? I think we could have a lengthy discussion about that, right? So a key question for a lot of people is social media serve to advance democracy or to challenge it, right? We've seen where it can challenge it when you have interference in liberal democratic elections by non-liberal democratic countries and so on. We can see that, but is that justification to curtail free speech? I would argue it isn't, right? But it's also equally wrong to say there isn't an issue there, because there clearly is an issue there, all right? So how do we manage it? That's why the course is called Free Speech and the Challenge of Social Media, right? Okay. For instance, many commentators have noted the tendency for social media to enable dialogue that undercuts fake facts and truth in public discourse. Nobody could legitimately dispute that fact. All right. I mean, we see it in conspiracy theories. We see it in hate speech and propagating anti-immigrant this and that and so on. We see this, right? I mean, lies about different groups of people and what they do, and those, they come into our country and they're always on welfare, and all these misinformation, right, and disinformation that's out there. Let's not pretend. Even if we're of a political view that we should do less immigration, we still cannot, with a straight face, claim that all of these statements are factual, right? So a lot of this stuff undercuts facts and truth in public discourse. To say that is not a political position. To say that is a factual position, all right? Free social media can delegitimize qualifications and expertise, and we see that all the way, attacking Dr. Tam during the COVID, attacking, the U.S. head public health doctor, during COVID, challenging the scientists that have found climate change, all of these. So to say that is also not occurring is factually incorrect. We know that that's happening as an artifact of social media, okay? Threatens public trust in democratic processes. Well, we've seen this happen, right? We're seeing it happen live now, south of the border, right? I mean, let's not pretend also that does not exist, because it does exist, all right? It can be factually proven and verified, which all facts must be. They must be identified and be verifiable, and we can certainly do that. Any intelligence agency in a liberal democratic country will have libraries full. Well, obviously on hard disks today, but libraries full of evidence to support this claim, okay? Diminishes social cohesion, mutual respect, understanding, and empathy. Is there anybody spend any time on social media today and not seen, sort of a breakdown in some of the social cohesion? Certainly a breakdown in mutual respect as people write anonymously behind their screen, insulting people, right? I mean, we've seen endless cases of that on a day-to-day basis, right? Understanding and empathy. Empathy, where is it? I mean, attacking female politicians and calling them names and all this kind of stuff through social media because it's anonymous, right? So again, completely factual. There's no question that this case can be heavily demonstrated with reams and reams of factual information, right? That can be replicated, okay? Creates polar extremes in political opinion. Well, can you turn on the media today without saying divided society, without saying the United States is more divided today than it's ever been? Now our own political party in Canada, one of them at least, is talking about divisions in society, because it becomes advantageous as well, right? I mean, politicians need to create cleavages, right? Because they want the support of one side as opposed to another side. That true can be factually demonstrated, all right? So to argue that social media does not challenge democracy in these areas is unsustainable once we look at the facts of the case. Okay, but again, is that enough to curtail free speech? And I would still argue that it isn't, all right, because of the value that free speech gives to a liberal democratic system. And I support a liberal democratic system, so I cannot just holus bolus say no free speech or yes free speech. I have to say yes free speech, but look, there are some challenges to free speech, and in order to protect free speech, we have to defend against these challenges. That's the only way we can do it, right? And can we do that, though, by the marketplace ideas, as Mill says? In other words, leave it alone and let it sort itself out. Can we do that? Well, it's a legitimate question, right? Or do we adopt the second liberal theory and say, yes, we want free speech, but we also have to protect it. And we have to protect people from harms that can emanate from bad use of the rights of free speech. All right? These are legitimate questions, both very legitimate questions. All right? So, and we have to acknowledge that social media does have quite startling capacities to upset political systems via outsized capacities to shape public opinion. And, we saw that with Brexit, right? We saw that clearly with the UK Brexit, very clearly. But before we go down this line of thinking too far, we must acknowledge that social media is a two-edged sword. As I just said, it's a two-edged sword, right? That's what makes it such a perplexing issue, right? Free speech and social media. Because if it was a simple problem, we could just say, well, let's just ban it. Man, we're good. Let's go, right? But in a liberal democracy, we can't do that, right? We value free speech, and for good reason, right? So what do we do, right? This is the question, right? So, social media has undoubtedly caused upheaval in political discourse of liberal democracies. We see that every day now. But then again, it facilitated the forces of change in authoritarian regimes, such as what happened with the Arab Spring in the 2010s. Social media was primarily responsible for allowing these social forces to overthrow essentially a corrupt and criminal regime. So again, we have the same sword, but it still has two edges. Okay? So indeed, social media, some would argue, anyway, has become weaponized in global and national political struggles. And this is becoming a threat, right? Because remember what free speech was supposed to allow us to debate, even debate vociferously, but still come up with a socially cohesive response. But social media may be getting weaponized to prevent that very cohesion, designed explicitly to, short-circuit that very cohesion. And we can also factually demonstrate that, all right, today, okay? So, again, right, we still have the same sword and it's got two edges, right? By now, students are undoubtedly aware that analysts around the world have accused social media platforms of enabling intervention in democratic elections by disruptive forces. We saw that 2016 election in the United States, the UK Brexit referendum, and so on. Our own security services in Canada saying that there are people from China and Russia trying to interfere in our electoral processes. It didn't become as extensive as Brexit or the US situation, but they were active. And I don't think there's any question that that's the case. But, one perspective might be to conclude that social media is not at odds with democracy, but rather has brought greater public awareness of threats to democracy that have always been present. I saw that kind of an argument in discussion board 1 and 2, right? If we repress hate speech, we're basically concealing, we're allowing them to go off and fester. It's the same kind of a principle, all right? I mean, I'm not saying that but that perspective comes from Mill and the marketplace of ideas, right? Whereas the second liberal perspective would say that's probably not true in a social media context anymore. And that's where we will explore that further when we get into the sections of the course that deal on our infrastructure and architecture of social media and what its implications are, okay? Because we cannot discount the fact that abuses have exploded in the public consciousness because of the unique characteristics of social media, right? Social media enables global communication reach at a lower cost and with greater speed than ever before in human history, right? Long before Mill would never have seen this happening, right? It would be naive at a minimum not to conclude that these characteristics are a significant challenge to our political and social systems, which were established in an era before the widespread adoption of computers, the internet, and home and office-based media technology. I mean, it would be naive to assume that this incredible technology that's now growing around the world is not transformative. It is transformative. The question we ask ourselves in free speech and the challenge of social media is, how transformative is it? Is it a benefit or a threat to free speech? Is it both, and in what areas? Okay. On that question, let's look at abuses of social media platforms. Okay. Before going too far down this road as well, right? It's important for students to realize that the risks of controlling the abuses also are a problem, right? I mean, we have abuses, but whenever we want to start controlling free speech, that is not without risk, right, to a liberal democracy and in a liberal democracy and freedoms within a liberal democracy. Authoritarian regimes, for example, are typically eager to place broad restrictions on free speech, including in social media, right? We've seen that. We've got firewall in China, right? Same thing emerging in Russia and in Belarus and other authoritarian regimes who block any content that they feel is threatening to the overarching power of the state, right? We don't want that, right? We don't want that in Canada, right? That's anathema to our liberal democracy, right? And indeed, despite what should be the golden age of free speech, right? Given the capacities afforded by social media, right, that I just mentioned, right? Low cost, fast, goes around the world in a click of a mouse, right? We are in fact witnessing an age where free speech is under pressure globally. Remember I told you, right? The extent that we allow free speech abuses, we allow arguments for how free speech can be curtailed. And that's what authoritarian regimes do, right? We can't have this free speech. It's a bunch of garbage. It's this, that, and the other. And they use that to leverage against free speech in a social media context. Take care of it or they'll take it away, right? That's the central question of our course. How do we take care of it so it's not taken away? How do we take care of it so that free speech is not seen as a bunch of garbled lies and untruths, right? This is the paradox of our time. It's the paradox of your generation who's come up in the social media era, right? It's a great challenge for everybody. Okay? And for this reason, liberal democracies typically approach social media regulations very carefully, though, right? And censorship of any kind with considerable trepidation, because we don't want to eliminate free speech in order to protect it. That would make much sense, right? But we have to protect people against certain forms of speech, perhaps, to protect free speech itself. Because if people keep getting attacked by a free speech environment, why should they defend it? Why should they defend it? Why should they care? That's very fertile ground for authoritarian thinking, isn't it? Right? If people aren't going to defend it, then who's going to defend it? The state? Well, that may be true now under certain governments, but what happens if somebody new gets elected? Maybe they're not so enamored with free speech and liberal democratic system. Some would argue that's what the situation that the U.S. finds itself in right now. Right? But this is why it's very important to look at the nuance of this issue. It's not so straightforward. It's not free speech or something bad. It's free speech, yes, but free speech that is completely abused and often abused may in fact challenge free speech itself. The people stop supporting it because they view it as all a bunch of garbage. What's good that going to do, right, to liberal democracy and free speech? So we have a problem. Let's not pretend we don't have a problem with this. We have a problem with this, okay? So liberal democracies cannot put their heads in the sand, right? Oxford University researchers, for example, in 2019 found that at least 70 countries have had disinformation campaigns directed at them, mostly to disrupt their liberal democratic electoral systems, okay? The European Union estimates that companies connected to the Kremlin spend approximately 10 billion euros yearly on political propaganda known as troll factories. Right? Factual. The purpose of troll factories, according to security services in Europe and North America, have never been to support specific political parties, quite apart from the dialogue, right? But rather damage the overall trust in democratic institutions and processes, including free speech. They attack the belief systems that free speech is good by making free speech disruptive, insulting, problematic. They challenge the very fiber of the public support for free speech, right? We have to guard against that as well, too, right? So when regulating free speech, we have to be very cautious not to play into that game, right? But we also have to recognize that we can't allow completely unfettered, harmful free speech on social media. So what is that line? Where do we pitch that line, right? Very difficult situation that may take another 30, 40, 50 years to completely sort out, right? It might. Who knows, okay? Non-government extremists have also used social media to advance the efforts to attack liberal democracy and social values. Media was used aggressively by the neo-Nazis and Ku Klux Klan to mobilize Unite the Right protests in Charlottesville in 2017. Lots of write-ups on that now to demonstrate that fact. Misinformation and disinformation and hate speech flowed abundantly to agitate the atmosphere leading to violence. Is that the free speech that's building social cohesion for liberal democracy and so on? No, of course not, right? So what is this phenomenon we're seeing, right? The Ku Klux Klan always existed, right? Neo-Nazis always existed. But now we have social media that enables an outreach from those groups in such a way that there's a whole new sphere of challenge to liberal democracy and to free speech itself, all right? Misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech flowed abundantly, and we know that, right? Problems like these, where are too many to list here, will almost certainly continue or perhaps escalate if actions are not taken to counter them. All right, but again, right? We're all here. Free speech, yeah, we're enamored by the liberal democratic paradigm of free speech, no question. I certainly am. But to pretend that we don't have challenges to free speech and to liberal democratic systems through social media is to be naive. Okay? So what should the actions be? Right? And that's what we're going to explore in the remainder of our course. Okay? As we go along, we'll be discussing more of this. All right? So on that score, I'll let you go. All right? And I think I'll allow you to take these slides up yourself. Okay, I didn't post the slides today for you because I want you to hear me speak to them, and then I want you to go through the slides, because I suspect from some of the quiz responses that I was getting, some of the quiz scores I was getting, some of you were looking at my video and you're not studying the slides yourself. All right. So I want you can listen to my narrative on the presentation, but you can also then, you should look at the slides and study the slides, highlight key concepts and so on. So when the time comes, you're not sort of guessing on the quizzes or so on, right? So in other words, you need to look at the slides and study the slides. You need to look at my video and listen to me interpret the slides, because I offer you a perspective, right, on the slides, and a very informed perspective since I designed the slides, but it's one perspective, right? And I want you to take these things I'm talking about into your consideration and to inform your own views on these things. All right. So I want you to you can look at my narrative, but I also want you to check the slides and read those independently. All right. So in the future, read the slides, then listen to my narrative. All right. And that way, I think those people that didn't do necessarily as well as they should have on the quiz can be better prepared to face the next quiz, but also better prepared to do their first video when we come to that, all right, in week 7. Okay? So this is what the approach I want you to take, because I'm suspecting that a lot of you, like I say, are looking at my video and not studying the slides yourself. So listen to my narrative the way you did today, but then study the slides closely as well. All right? On that note, I'll let you go. Bye-bye for now.